The Hangout on Air is now live. Hello, everybody. Is anybody here with us? Showing up on my iPad. All right. And I don't show the rest of you here. Let me see if I can add you. I'm going to ask you guys to, I'm going to send you a new link to click on. I'm sending it right as soon as Facebook decides to respond. See, I don't see how the keystroke medium guys do this like twice a week. This live YouTube stuff is kind of for the birds a little bit. Yeah, I know, but you guys aren't with me, so sending you. Yeah, that can't. My Facebook has just gone complete inactive. Of course it has, because this is live. To those couple of you out there watching, having a couple of technical difficulties, we'll be right with you. Link that I just to everyone in the group.
Hello, sir.
Hello. Hello, Steve. And hello, Ian.
Hello.
And hello, Christopher.
Hello.
And there's Ed. Hello, Ed.
Hello. I'm a little slow.
That's okay.
Hank, we can't see your beautiful face.
Yeah, I know. I'm working on it. That's because I have the camera turned off. There I am.
Hey.
All right. All right. So, oh, that's the wrong video. All right. Now I'm going to kill the audio on my iPad so we don't get. All right. So, welcome, everybody. I think we are actually live now. Today, joining me to talk about heroes and villains, writing superhero stories, super villain stories, and these iconic stories and characters that we all love so much. I don't know about the rest of my panel with me today, but I'm representing with my Justice League shirt and kind of old school 70s Justice League / Super Friends. So Anyway, joining me today is Steve Bowyer or Baloo, or there's a lot.
Yeah, ask
ways.
Kevin Summers. Kevin will pronounce it in 7 different ways.
Yeah. In all in the introduction to his story in the book.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. Also, Ian Garner is with me. I'm going across the panel here. Hello, Ian. And
Hello.
Ed Ghazni, the probably the most knowledgeable person that I know when it comes to comics. He is a walking encyclopedia, a wealth of knowledge, and all-around great guy. Welcome, Ed.
Hi, Hank.
And Christopher Vallon is on the show with me. Christopher wrote one of my favorite superhero stories a while back in a book called Sidekick. I absolutely love that book, and I'm happy you could join us today, Christopher.
Thanks for having me.
So one thing we have in common, this group of folks, is we all participated in this dual anthology that dropped a couple weeks ago that Steve put together and edited, curated, all that good stuff. The Heroes and Villains. Ed is holding up a copy there, and I know that Christopher has a copy as well. So it was split into 2 different books, one stories about heroes and one just stories about villains, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So first, I'm going to introduce Steve, since this was his baby and his project. Where did the idea come from, Steve? And tell us a little bit about yourself for folks who may not know who you are.
Well, of course, the project really kind of started because I absolutely love superheroes, love comic books. Been a comic book collector for a long time. To be honest, though, really this book idea started because I had a passion to design some book covers. That was it. I had a thought in my head to design the "It's a Bird, It's a Plane" book cover. And I did it one day, and I went, all right, how do I use this? And I said, well, I really don't want to write a novel. So I said, I bet there'd be a lot of people interested in writing superhero short stories. And I literally, I don't know, put the word out, and within 30 minutes, I think I had every single person that's currently on, maybe barring a few, but man, it was an overwhelming response of authors that just wanted to write something about superheroes or supervillains, and I couldn't be more happy with the lineup. It's been fantastic. A couple I think Chris has one in both books, and I feel like somebody else
Overachiever.
did. Who else did? Somebody else did. Doesn't matter. Chris did. Chris is the only one that's here. So it was a fun project, dude. It came along real quick, real fast. Everyone knocked out their stories. None of them required heavy editing. It was beautiful. It was a wonderful thing.
I remember that day that you announced it, and it was almost like you announced it as kind of a lark and like, hey, who wants to do this? And like you were literally inundated within minutes. Like, oh crap, what have I?
And there was actually,
done?
Well, you remember, I think I was on your show like the next day, actually, or soon after that, and it got leaked out that we were doing this project, and it wasn't even necessarily a real thing yet, and it got leaked out. And, you know, the Twitter world got violently angry that there were no women on board. And, and I'm like, guys, this wasn't even a real project 35 minutes ago. So can we just relax?
Yeah. That was, well, we'll chalk it up to people being passionate about.
Yeah, it was an exciting thing, man.
And wanting to be included. And we love that. But yeah, let's get all the information first. That's all we're saying. Get all the information first. So yeah, it was probably one of the fastest anthology projects I've worked on. Usually somebody announces it and it's like 6 months, meaning everybody starts writing their stories at about 5 months and 2 weeks. And all the stories come in all at once, you know, and then a month and a half later, the book comes out. This whole thing was 3 months, wasn't it?
Yep. Just about to the day, 3 months to the day.
Yeah.
I'm one of those. I don't know. When there's a project in front of me, whether it's music, books, whatever, I don't like sitting around.
Yeah.
I feel like if it's a project worth doing, it's something that should be able to be done pretty quickly. I also had to learn really quick that I tend to be a fast writer. Not everybody, you know, I lost a lot of people that first round because they just couldn't hit the deadline. And so this time around, the next round, we're gonna push the deadline a little bit, but not much. I can't do the 6 months, 8 months just to get a book out. I mean, we're talking 4,000 words a piece, 5,000 words a piece. Chris Vallon does that in his sleep. So.
Yes, he does. He's not to be trifled with. Yeah, for sure. Next up, Ian, how did you come to be a part of this, and what is your story about?
I think I found out about it because I came home from school one day. And you were like, "Hey, you want to do a supervillain story?" I'm like, "Yeah." So he's like, "All right, go talk to Steve. He'll set you up."
Mm-hmm.
So that's the story of how I got into a supervillain anthology. Whole thing took about 10 minutes. I just walked in the door. Hey, you're in this thing. Okay.
Hashtag nepotism.
Yeah.
So I emailed Steve. He was like, "Yeah, come on in." So I pitched him a story of redemption about a supervillain who's been in prison for 15 years, and he has a chance to earn some forgiveness in order by taking down the current supervillain. And it doesn't exactly end the way that you think it should, or maybe it ends exactly the way you think it should. But I found it to be a really fun exercise just to see what I can come up with. So,
Gotcha.
It's a good story. Good story.
Thank you.
Ed Ghazni, he's my hero, really, when it comes to comic collecting and knowledge of the genre. Welcome to the show, Ed. Tell us how you got to be a part of this, and what's your story about?
Well, I was actually in downtown Cleveland, Ohio, at an Irish pub having lunch with my wife and oldest daughter, and I decided while we were waiting for our food, check Facebook. Why not? So I pulled out my phone, checked Facebook, and I had a message from Chris Porteau, who's in the Hero edition, and he let me know about this, that it was going on. And he said, I think, I can talk to Steve if you're interested. As soon as I saw comics, I knew that this would be something you'd be interested in. So I have Chris to thank for that. I didn't know Steve prior to that. I knew who Steve was. I knew about Brother Dust. So I couldn't wait for Chris to let him know. I just had to go ahead and introduce myself, and I could leave a message and said, I want in. So I was all excited.
So many good stories have begun with one day in an Irish pub in Cleveland. This is just the latest in a long litany of stories to begin that way.
I was actually writing some Homeric poetry while I was there waiting for my grub, but
Of course you were. Of course you were.
I mean, that's what we all do. So that's not really that exciting. I mean, we all
right. We don't really publicize it because why would you? It's redundant.
Right.
So what's your story about it?
My story is about a teenage boy who comes into some superpowers. He's invulnerable, it seems. He can fly. He can move at super speeds. And the story's told through journal entries by his best friend, who is extremely jealous, basically, that, his best friend gets superpowers and kind of cuts him out of his life. So as you're reading it, you have to decide for yourself who's the real villain and who's the real hero in this story. But it's kind of a sad story in a way of what could possibly happen if teenagers, people who aren't very mature yet, gain powers like this, and what would happen.
Awesome. Was this a story that you already had an idea for and just looking for a place for it, or did it just come to you as as kind of the inspiration of the event, came about?
Yeah, Steve said, choose if you want to be hero or villain, and I just thought, I'll do villain because so many people always want to do hero. So it was one of those at midnight, lying in bed. I have sleep apnea, so I wake up a lot, and then stories tumble through my head, and after a couple nights, it kind of came to me.
Man, I wish I had sleep apnea. That sounds great. Stories just come to you. Oh my
gosh.
That was Steve.
All day long too, just to stay awake. So there's
That was Steve Bollier. He can be reached at paulandbollier@gmail.com. Ed, I want to come back to that theme in a minute of these villain stories because I really want to kind of peel back the layers of that in a minute. But let's bring Christopher Vallon into the show. Hello, Christopher. Like I said at the beginning, you are the author of a book that I dearly love, and I'm super happy to have you on the show. But how did you get involved with this, and what is your story?
I was writing some Homeric poetry in an Irish pub in Cleveland, and I overheard Ed talking to actually, I didn't know Steve at the time, so I didn't hear about it actually. He contacted me and said he heard that I was a superhero guy and asked if I'd be interested in doing something for the anthology. And I said, yeah, I'd love to, because I actually had started working on a short story already, and was going to start sending it out to people doing superhero anthologies. So it worked out really good,
Nice.
really well. And the story is the hero story is one of the characters from Sidekick, his mentor, Black Carrier, who's kind of a mashup of Batman and Iron Man, and so it's just kind of a day in the life of a modern day superhero. He gets a close-up picture taken of him on a cell phone, and has to deal with that because once it gets uploaded and people use facial recognition and stuff like that, he's going to end up blowing his identity. And then, but there were some. I guess there was some slots available on the villain one, and so I asked Steve, I said, would you rather have me do a villain one? Because there was also a story I had started previously about a supervillain in the same Sidekick universe that I call the Raptorverse, after Red Raptor, main character. And he said, well, you can do one in each if you really want to. And I said, yeah, I'll do it. And so the second one is about a guy named Battle Gear who's a supervillain, but he's kind of a reluctant supervillain. He just kind of decides that that's the way to get to his hero, Eagle Star, rather than becoming the hero himself.
Nice. We'll come back and dig into that in just a minute. I also contributed a story to the villains because villains are misunderstood. I'll just put it that way. And I wanted to bring a little love and empathy to the villains. Mine's called Dreamer, and it's about a character who has these very vivid dreams, and they believe they are predicting the future, and look to find a way to intervene, or even wrestling with the idea of if they should intervene or not. And you find out later in the story. I won't spoil it, but there's something else going on. So I just had this idea for kind of a villain that maybe didn't know they were a villain, and what happens if you do things that you're not even aware of. And so I wanted to kind of explore that idea, and I think it was kind of quirky and weird, and I hope it turned out okay. But anyway, that's my story for it. So the next thing I would like to ask is, what are each of your first memories of comics? What was your first introduction to comic books, and specifically to the superhero genre? Kind of what brought you into this, Steve?
I would say early, maybe even as early as 5 or 6. As far as comic books, of course, I think all of us were probably introduced to superheroes earlier than that in some form or fashion. But when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my family was really big into yard sailing, garage sailing, going from garage sale to garage sale on Saturday mornings. And I remember coming across a comic book box, and it must not have been very expensive because my parents bought it for me. And so I recently actually got that. My brother sent me that box, and I thought there was a lot better stuff in it. It was a bunch of just crap. It was like a shredded up Richie Rich, and then like, I don't know, some stuff I've never even heard of. But there were a couple of Spider-Man comics in there, and I remember sitting at my kitchen table trying to copy the drawing side by side. You know, I've always been into art, and that was really like my first introduction. I remember looking at Spider-Man, and he was fighting the Hobgoblin, and I have a very vivid memory of sitting there drawing that particular scene.
Nice. Do you remember what the first comic was that you bought with your own money?
Yeah, probably like Spawn #1. I think it was probably very beginning of the Spawn series back in the early 90s.
Nice. What was it about Spawn that you liked?
I don't know. Like, I think probably as a pastor, the worst thing I could say is Spawn is my favorite comic, you know, but at this point in time, that's not necessarily true, but I do have a goal in life to collect all of the Spawns, and I'm pretty dang close at this point, but
we won't tell
yeah,
anyone.
Except everyone listening, and I mean everyone that's ever been to my house, and but
we're going to release this on the podcast feed later this week too, so 100,000 people will hear it there.
Perfect.
But we won't tell them.
I have no shame, so I'm good to go. I don't know what drew me to him. He was cool looking. I mean, I was young. I was 8, 9 years. How old was I in 1991 or whatever it was when it came out? I don't want to tell you guys because it'll make you feel bad about how old.
Dude, I was grown in 1991. What the heck?
I was I was close to. I was 8. Yeah, I was 8 years old. So.
All right, moving right along.
You're welcome.
Yeah. You're welcome. All right, Ian. What's your first memory of getting involved in comics?
I think it was the first Spider-Man movie that came out in like 02, 03, something like that. And
back when Steve was still a tyke.
Yeah.
Back when your dad was just an old man.
Does that mean he's reached wizard level now?
Oh, he's a level 5 laser lotus.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah.
Laser Lotus.
But I think that movie was my first big introduction to the comics world. I'd seen cartoons, of course, because who hasn't? But I wasn't really big into comic book heroes or villains or anything like that until that movie came out. And I love that movie. I still love that movie. And now we've got the 19th Spider-Man movie coming out this week.
That's out.
That's out. The first Tobey Maguire movie? Is that the one you're talking about?
That's the one.
Yeah. I've heard good things about the new movies. Anybody seen it yet?
Yeah, great things.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm probably going to have to go see that soon. Just
yeah.
Just
so
see
what was
how good it is.
So Spider-Man was the initial draw for you?
I think that's that and the Hulk, but Hulk came like a year later. That first Hulk movie with Eric Bana in it. I know it got a lot of hate, but I still like that movie. I really enjoyed it, and I still wish Marvel would do another solo Hulk movie. But Thor 3 is coming out soon, so we'll have a little Hulk action in that. So I'll take what I can get.
Yeah. So this interesting thing happens when you get to the Ian's generation. Movies were the impetus, whereas those books were for the rest of us. And I still remember going to see the first Superman movie with Chris Reeve, and thinking, oh man, this comic book has come to life, and which is an interesting twist there. What was the first comic that you remember reading that really stuck you, Ian?
I think I know it was a Batman comic. I want to say it was one of the Long Halloween series. Because yes, because I remember when I was 15, I got the first 150 Batman issues, digital copies, along with a couple other graphic novels in the series. I think Long Halloween is probably the one that stuck out with me the most at that time, and that's what made me a diehard Batman fan at the time. And if you've seen the Keystroke Medium episode that I've been on a couple weeks ago, you'll know I love Batman. So yeah, I credit Long Halloween to my Batman love and affinity.
Nice. Ed Ghazni, what is your first memory of superhero comics, and how did you get started in all this?
Okay, I think it was 1938. No. That's my father. My father had the very first Superman comic book, which is very But It doesn't exist anymore. He's been a battleship during World War II. But mine was the Adam West Batman show in 1966. So I am aging myself a bit. Yes, I got to watch it when it first aired. That was the most exciting thing in my world. I was born in 62, so I was just a little tyke, and my parents would go out dancing, and I would get in the bath and run down and sit on Susie the Sitter's lap and watch what was just like heaven to me at the time, watching the Batman and Robin live on TV. My first comic book I ever bought, it didn't come around until actually October 1973. It was Amazing Spider-Man number 125. With Spider-Man versus the Man-Wolf.
Was that the first introduction of Man-Wolf?
He was in the previous issue, but I'm not sure if that was the first introduction or not. I can't recall it. I think 124 was actually his first issue. I have it. I went and bought it, because all of us who love these go back and try to fill in some gaps, just like Steve collecting that evil spawn. But
Mm-hmm.
That TV show, the 66 Batman, gets a lot of hate. Well, not a lot of hate. I think we've come around now where people look on it with nostalgia, but especially in the 90s and 2000s, when you, Steve, I think we've lost the rest of the panel here. See, they're devolved into. And anyway, when that first Tim Burton Batman movie came out, it's when you look back on it now, it's super campy, but at the time it was like this dark and earnest Batman. And then you looked at the Adam West Batman, it was like, oh man, that was so corny and cheesy, but that really was the gateway drug for a whole generation or two generations, because I remember watching them in reruns, and that was my Batman. Until the Tim Burton Batman came out when I was just out of high school, I think. So that was my Batman forever.
Yeah.
Well, of course, I'm sorry.
I was going to say the young kids like Ian and Steve even, they get these great movies today, and we had to suffer through like terrible Wonder Woman made for TV movies and Captain America. I mean, there were some real clinkers out there through the 70s and early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes. When did you begin collecting comics in earnest?
73, when I got that Spider-Man, that was it, man. I was like collecting pocket change as much as I could. Got a subscription to. I started selling Grit. If you ever heard of that newspaper,
I sold Grit.
Knocking on neighbors' doors, and that was my comic book money, and then grass cutting later.
Nice. Christopher Vallon, what's your first memory of getting into comics, and what did it for you?
Like you guys, the Batman TV show, but I think I'm about the same age as you, Hank. I was watching them in the reruns in the early 70s. Just loved it. The first comic I remember having was one of those giant-sized Treasury Edition Batman comics.
Oh yes.
And I think I was only 4 or 5. So, I don't even remember getting it. I just remember having it. I used to play with the Mego action figures, and had a bunch of those superheroes and Planet of the Apes. And then the first time I remember buying a comic book with my own money, I was probably about 8 years old, and I gathered some change and rode my bike a couple miles down to the supermarket and went to one of those old spinner racks and got an issue of Ghost Rider, mid-70s sometime. And,
nice.
Kind of got obsessed. And so I was cutting lawns and, doing yard work for people for money. So that's mostly what I bought with my own money was comic books.
Nice. Ian, people used to have to do work for money.
Oh, okay.
You and I don't really, Mom, Dad, can I,
Millennials.
Man, you tell him, Ian, get on him, man. You come on.
We have these conversations. Don't worry. Don't worry. He knows I love him.
I should add, later on, I was a manager of a comic book store. So that was
Shut up.
Yeah, that was like being a dealer who used my own product a little too much. I think
it's everyone's dream.
I have over 10,000 comic books in my collection.
Stop it. Well, yeah, that is like getting high on your own supply. You have to watch out. It's a fine line you have to walk there.
Yeah.
When did you do that? Like
when I was in college, started working at one store that went out of business, and then my friend was working at another store. I got a job there. I was about 19, 20 years old, and eventually I became the manager at the store. And
would this have been like early '90s when the big comic book boom was happening?
Yeah, 80,
the bubble
80,
that burst.
Yeah, I think '88. I started working there, and I was a manager in the early '90s when we were getting in thousands and thousands. Like Spawn #1, we probably had 1,000 copies of that literally when it came in. It's Spider-Man, the new McFarlane Spider-Man #1, the new X-Men #1. Those we would just have boxes and boxes, and they would come in, and we'd be there till like 2 or 3 in the morning, putting them all in the bags and the backboards, and it was a crazy time for comic books. But
that X-Men #1, the Jim Lee art, I think sold I forget how many millions of copies, but it was insane.
Yeah.
It was insane. I have a stack of comic books on my shelf back here behind me that you can't see that my friend Doug gave me, and they're all early '90s, and they were all from that period where people were telling folks, buy 2 or 3 copies of every comic because they're going to be worth a fortune one day. And, a year later, they're just back to being comic books. Yeah, I think we've all experienced a little bit of that. But my first memory is I've told the story on the podcast before where I was in first grade, I believe it was. I was having a really hard time with reading. I had horrible dyslexia, and which didn't get really worked out until college. But and my mom, we were on our way to my grandparents' house. They lived about 25 miles away from us or so, and my mom gave me a Superman comic and a Justice League comic. And I remember sitting in the backseat of the car and flipping through those, and it just changed everything for me. I could follow along with the story, and I could see the action, and then I could then work out the dialogue bubbles and stuff, and it unlocked it for me, and that was literally my salvation in a lot of different ways. And so I was a Superman fan, from early on, and the Justice League always held a really special place for me. So I'm a DC fan through and through, and anyway. So,
can you stop with the hate speech, please?
Yeah, I see you. I see you, Dr. Strange. I love Dr. Strange. I think Dr. Strange is fantastic. I just have a special place for the Justice League. That's all. Can't we all get along? Does it have to be either or? Speaking of hate,
even the version with Aquaman and Vixen and Firestorm.
Look, I didn't say everything's perfect. I never said everything was perfect. It's kind of like our family. We go through weird situations sometimes. And sometimes we just have to look away for a little bit and know they're going to come back into the fold. Things happen. The only
difference is that with the Justice League, one of them, nobody in my family is so overpowered that they have to invent something that he's allergic to. I mean,
Yeah, I'm gonna give you that.
That's entirely fair.
Yeah, that's all right. So, Steve, when you decided to split this into heroes and villains, what did you expect, and did anything surprise you in the types of stories that you got?
Dude, this happens so organically. It's kind of hard, and of course, you've already mentioned how quick it happened. So
yeah.
it was kind of like one of those things where one day I announced that we were going to do a heroes book. The next day I had so many authors that were interested that I thought maybe we'll do 2. The next day I realized, why don't we, I think I was talking with Rhett Bruno, a good friend of mine, and I think he made the comment, why don't you do 2 different volumes and pit them against each other? And really, I mean, all we really did was just within our fun little authors group kind of had a sales competition to see who would sell more. And by the way, the heroes are definitely the winners. I'll say that. But as far as the stories,
Says the guy that controls the stats.
Hey, I'm just listen. I got a story in both books, so I have no dog in this hunt, as we would say here in Texas. But I would say this: some of the surprising aspects of that, a lot of the writers really were not even superhero fans. That was kind of the interesting thing. They were more like I don't know, young adult magic kind of style fantasy writers, and those kinds of characters come pretty dang close to the superhero genre if twisted properly.
Yeah.
And so they were able to pull off some characters that I thought were really, really unique and really interesting. Rhett Bruno surprised me with the Roach, worst name for a superhero outside of the Tick. And
pretty lateral
yeah, and he pulled off a great story. I thought it was fantastic. So
that's awesome. You said you wrote a story for each volume, but which one did you gravitate toward first? Did you want to do a
Aaron Hall and I, we write together quite a lot. And so what we did was originally the intent was that I was going to write the villain story because I had this guy in mind, this character in mind, and he was going to write the hero story. And that is precisely how it worked out. I took primary on the villains. He took primary on the heroes. And for once in our writing careers, like really, we didn't touch each other's stories hardly at all. We just, we edited each other's stories and made them a little bit crisper. But so I gravitate toward Villain for a Day, which is the one in the Villains volume. And actually, Vallon and I are currently adapting that to a full novel and throwing it into his Raptorverse. Is that a secret, Chris? Are we good?
Yeah.
It's not anymore. But I just loved it, man. Art Williams, the name of the character, and he's just this arrogant tool bag of a guy who
tool bag?
It's kind of interesting, man. He doesn't have very, very exciting powers. He considers himself the smartest man in the world, and truth be told, he probably is. He came out of the womb with the intellect of a 2-year-old or something. I don't remember what I wrote. That was a long time ago. But
me too. It just stayed that way for a while.
Yeah, right. But he's got the reflexes of a cat. He's got 9 lives like a cat. He's very cat-like, and so there's a lot of humor in the book. There's some dark themes, and it's a fun story. It was fun enough for me to call up Chris and say, "Hey, can we do this? You want to do this thing together?" And he jumped on it as well. So, and the hero story, man, the hero story is about a janitor in the Justice League Hall, although we don't call it the Justice League Hall. Aaron Hall had this idea for just this real periphery character that we all don't care about at all, somehow being the center of the story, and I thought it was a great idea, and it ended up being really good.
That's a fantastic idea. Ian, what do you wrote a villain story, and yes. Why did you write a villain story, and what do you think makes a great villain? Like we know that we can't, that great heroes are always they're always shown in a better light when they're up against a great villain. There's got to be this light and dark, this yin, this yang, this, whatever you want to call it. There's the two things playing off each other, and for the good to really show up as good, you've got to have a really great challenge for that. So what is the challenge in writing a villain, and why did you want to write a villain story?
All right. Well, I had the idea for the villain story for couple of years now. I just never really knew where to put it, what to do with it, until this opportunity came up. I'm like, oh, well, that's how I do it. So I'm like, we all have great hero stories, and we all focus on the hero. I want to do something that focuses on the villain, because I personally think they're the most interesting characters. Like, a hero can, throw mountains, and he can hurl planets and everything, and the villain is just kind of the secondary Like in the movie, they get like 20 minutes of screen time. We don't really know what their motivations are sometimes. And I'm like, well, that's where the story is right there. So I decided that I wanted to write the villain story because I think it would be a challenge in humanizing these characters. Like, it's from the get-go, you know that you're supposed to hate these people. And most of the time, we just blindly do it. We don't know why we hate them. We don't know why we're rooting against them. I want to outline that more. I was like, okay, well, what did this person do? Why did this person wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to be a villain? Or does he feel bad about those decisions? So I'm writing about this guy, Graviton, who controls gravitational forces. And it's probably one of the greatest powers you could ever have because you can basically manipulate everything. But he's got all this power and he uses it for bad. What does he feel? Like, does he regret doing the things that he's done? So he's in his jail cell for 15 years floating in an anti-gravity chamber because if you control gravity but you're in an anti-gravity chamber, you're kind of powerless. So you just kind of float around. And all you have are your thoughts. And so you have to think back, wow, I completely destroyed most of the West Coast. All those people died, and I'm stuck in jail. Was it worth it? Would I change it? Could I go back and fix it if I could? If I had a time machine, would I do things differently? And then all of a sudden you have someone come in and say, hey, I'm going to give you a chance to fix it, or at least atone for some things. It was difficult because, you know, you don't want to write a villain story that sounds campy. The immediate thing is like, we're going to do the guy with the curly mustache and the fedora and the cheesy one-liners. And to an extent, I did put a few of those in there because, you know, I want to be somewhat humorous, but I didn't want to go overboard with it. I just wanted to make a real guy, just like you or me, and I wanted to give him powers, and I wanted to make him question his life choices. And, you know, I'm not a supervillain. I don't have any superpowers, but I just figured, you know, at the end of the day, he's just a guy. He's a human being, just like me and you and everyone else. So he shouldn't be that difficult to write. It's just you have to make him deal with things that other people don't. So that was the interesting part for me, giving him that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That was the first time I've ever been called a real man.
Really?
In my whole life. So
Really?
a real guy, just like you and me. And I was just, it just spoke to me on a level that I just, oh, thank you, Ian.
You're welcome.
That was healing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, where did I go from there? Ed, you also wrote a villain story. What was your motivation behind your story, and why do you think those stories appeal to us?
In thinking about writing a villain, I wanted to go with somebody more like a Neymar. I mean, if you know Neymar, sometimes he's considered a hero, sometimes a villain. He's
Right.
just protecting his kingdom. But the Earth people see him, you know, the people on the ground see him as an enemy quite often. And he's trying to protect his place. So, and I don't want to give away too much because you kind of have to read it. And as I said, decide who you think is the real hero and who's the real villain, or vice versa. Or maybe there's two villains, maybe two heroes. But that's the kind of thinking I had. But probably my biggest thought, my biggest idea for the book, and it's like one of my darkest parts of the book, it came to me while I was sitting in church. And, you know, you just have to love that. You're sitting there, you know, and everything's real nice. You're hearing the sermon, and suddenly you think of something really diabolical that a teenager does. And then you whip out the phone and start taking notes in your phone. So.
Same.
But yeah, I like a villain who isn't just like Ian said, who, you know, not with the twirly mustache and all that, but somebody who's a human being and maybe even thinks he's the hero.
Right. You know, I interviewed run over that again. I interviewed Tad Williams yesterday, and we were talking about he was talking about writing fantasy in a post-Tolkien world, and kind of what the landscape was like when he started, and the kinds of what resonated with him about Tolkien stories, but also the things that he felt differently about. and he said that he likes to write characters that are all of his characters are the heroes of their own stories, and that it's up to the rest of us to put our perspective on that. And a villain who has these deeply held motivations, I think they make the best villains because they think they're right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think that was the strength that Man of Steel had, and you can love or hate the movie, but Zod was probably the strongest character in that movie because he actually thought he was doing the right thing. And it kind of breaks your heart at the end of a movie because you're like, considering how all the Kryptonians at this point were just kind of like worker ants, they were just kind of assigned things at the beginning. Was he even a bad guy, or was he just doing what he thought was right for his people? And that's really stuck with me for the past couple of years. Ever since watching that movie, it gives me a whole new respect for the character and the movie itself.
Yeah. Hank,
What's
I can't name drop Tad Williams and stuff, but I was talking to Jesus Christ the other day.
Really?
And I was thinking about the sermon I was going to write for the next time I preach, and I was really hoping that it inspires somebody to think diabolically. That's really the goal I think every pastor has when they prepare their sermon.
Well, that's what Ed's pastor did. That's what maybe one day you can ascend to the level of Ed's pastor.
Sometime, man. I'll call that guy and let him know. Right.
Well, what Ian said is exactly what Ed was just saying with Namor. Those are the characters that one thing about the Joker is that he's a great villain because you never know what he's going to do. But one thing I always wish I got more from is that you don't know why he does what he does, and I think that would make a more interesting character. Except they purposefully hide that he's this character that has no backstory or whatever. But it works for him. But I like a character that you understand what's going on with him. Anyway, Chris, what did you write, a hero or a villain story?
Both.
Yeah. What was your motivation for each one of them?
For my hero story, when I did Sidekick, I decided for a number of reasons to concentrate on the sidekick, on the young character. But I really liked the main, the hero, the main superhero, Black Carrier. So I wanted to write a story where he was the main character. His story was pretty dark in Sidekick. He goes through a lot, and I wanted to show a different side of him, basically. That it wasn't everything he went through wasn't always that dark and everything. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to do one that was a little bit humorous and also show off his other side, besides because he spends most of what you see him in Sidekick, he spends most of the time as Black Carrier, not as Frank Douglas, which is his secret identity. So I want to show him in that light a little more. And then did you have a question about that?
Oh, no, I was going to say, why do you think sidekicks have kind of fallen out of favor in the last? It used to be Batman and Robin, and there's still a Batman and Robin comic, but. And then Green Arrow had had Speedy, and everybody had a sidekick there for a while, and that's kind of fallen out of favor. And I loved when you wrote a book focused on that. But why do you think that's kind of fallen out of favor?
Well, I think one reason is the idea of putting a kid or a teenager in danger like that, fighting sometimes murderous people, is probably a little. You're not very PC nowadays, right?
That's what I've done with my kids. I don't see what the problem is.
But by the way, I have to say I'm really impressed with Ian. I'm a high school teacher, and so I read a lot of work, a lot of writing from young people, and I really am impressed with his writing and his ability to articulate himself.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I think that's one of the main reasons is people want more realism. There's one thing when comic books were more fantasy oriented,
Yeah.
but once they started getting darker and more realistic, I think that the idea that a grown adult, a responsible grown adult, especially a hero, would put a kid in danger like that it is a little ridiculous.
It is. Here, son, put this spandex on and let's jump around off of buildings.
I make a comment in Sidekick. The character makes a comment that maybe that's the reason that heroes have sidekicks is to they got the villains think, oh, that's he's an easy target, I'm going to go after him, and that's a distraction, so they can, and then they dress him in bright colors, like Robin's in this bright red and green, well, Batman's all like hidden in the shadows.
I don't appreciate y'all judging my parenting choices. Really.
There's this one time.
It's honestly off limits. Okay, it's honestly off limits. But so, what about your villain story, and how did you decide to tackle this character?
My original idea for that story came from I used to be a screenwriter, or I mean, I still am to a certain extent, and I had an idea for a TV series about a supervillain. And so my original idea was for that, but I thought it would also make a good short story. It's kind of almost an idea of if you look at the extent to which people go with their cosplaying nowadays, and how fancy they get with their costumes and their props and all that stuff. And just imagine if someone was like a super genius like Lex Luthor, but not necessarily that rich, and they just like took that to the level that they actually started, basically LARPing as against the heroes. And so this character, I mean, he's considered a supervillain. Like he makes these plans to like take over the world, and he teams up with other supervillains. But really, he just wants to fight the superheroes because he thinks that's a cool thing to do. That's like his world. So I don't know. It's kind of like if you're an actor and you wanted to be in a movie with your favorite actor, the funnest thing to do would be the person that goes up against that person, not necessarily their friend or whatever. So it's kind of the same idea, but in the superhero world. Right.
I dig it. I love it. Let's go back through Steve. What in a time and in a world where we have very serious fantasy literature and science fiction and things that are very important and very weighty and deal with world-changing events and things like this, and we've become very literary in our genre fiction. Why are these stories with these kind of over-the-top heroes and villains and stories like this that are larger than life? Why are these kinds of stories still important?
Well, you're asking a pastor a very loaded question right now, but I'm gonna steer. Okay, I'm gonna steer away.
Okay,
we're dealing with really heavy issues in our world today, but there are a lot of over the top characters, if you catch my drift, within the political world today.
Can you be more specific?
China. I don't know. In China, I just love China. China's amazing. It's
dodge
got
that.
Friends in China. So what I think is that people still want to escape. Maybe more so now than ever. People want an escape from the world that we live in, and furthermore, they want to see the good guys win. Because for so long, I think we've just watched evil triumph over good. And I bet you're gonna hear a different response based on whoever you ask that question. But I've watched evil triumph over good for most of my life. I don't remember. Maybe I'm gonna get too political here, but I don't remember the America that you guys grew up in. I live in a very, very different America. As a matter of fact, I live in Texas, and I feel bad for you guys that live in America. And honestly, you maybe don't know what that means until you move to Texas. I lived in Florida my whole life. I feel like I moved to a different country. I'm going to make enemies saying this, but I don't feel the pride for America that I wish that I did. And I think that that's so much of where we're at with escaping into these movies, escaping into these stories where there is the evil politician, there is the evil person that is manipulating the world. And man, when you see it on television or in a movie or in a book, you get to see the truth behind their manipulation. But when it happens in real life, we trick ourselves into believing that only the conspiracy theorists believe that it's actually happening, when in reality, there are powers that are working for their own benefit and not for the benefit of the people. And it's nice to see somebody rise up, even if they're in a costume and a cape and a mask, rise up to fight for the little guy and to fight for the people and to fight for justice. Truth, justice, and the American way. I mean, isn't that what Superman fought for? Well, what does that even mean anymore? What is the American way anymore? And again, maybe we don't want to get this political, but it's fair to ask the question, if a superhero rose up today, what would they really be fighting for?
It's a great question. It's a great question. Ian, what say you about why these stories are still important today, and what do you think they have to say?
For me, I would say they're allegorical. I don't know if I can attribute that for everyone, and someone else may have a different opinion, but here's my thing. A lot of kids don't like to read at all. Mm-hmm. So comic books are their outlet. That's what they read. That's what they pick up. That's what they're into. And I think that's fantastic. You know, if a kid wants to read and he doesn't want to read War and Peace, here's a Spider-Man comic book. You know, have fun with it. But I think it's important that they read these things, because for a lot of kids, that's the only lesson about morality and good versus evil that they're going to have, maybe for a long time. You know, maybe they don't have access to a library, they don't have access to books, they might not even have a TV to watch anything. So these comic books and other stories like this, that's where they're getting their information about the world. That's what it's their outlet of hey, I'm a little guy and I have a lot of problems in my life, but you know, so does the Hulk, so does Superman, so does Spider-Man, and they turned out all right. They stood up for something. They have morals. They have ideas, something they stand for, and even though they fight people who want to take that away from them, because they stand for something, they're coming out on top. There is a future. There is hope for people. I think they're important because they show us a little bit about who we are. It makes us think about the actions we make and the trials that we face every day. So I think it's just more of an allegory for life, for what we could have. And, you know, even though it looks bad right now, it doesn't always have to be that way. That's just me.
Well said. Mr. Ghazni, what do you say?
I love escapist literature. I mean, I grew up watching classic Star Trek and the old Planet of the Apes movies. I just love that kind of stuff in comic books, and it is a form of escape for me. But I'll also say, encountering Steve and living down in that country called Texas, which I understand it. My wife has relatives in Laredo, and when I'm there, it's like, oh, it's like a different country. But I served in the Army for 5 years. And there really are people who are willing to throw themselves on that hand grenade, just like Steve Rogers does in the first Captain America. Yeah. And when you see people like that, when you're surrounded by people like that, and the training you go through together, the things you do. And I was a journalist, so I interviewed people who had fought in Vietnam. It gives you a completely different perspective. And I like heroes, you know, most people to win, even though I wrote a villain story, which villains can be won. Yeah, I do see things a little bit differently than Steve does, and I think that does come from the time I grew up. But you know, I love the fantasy literature, love all the superhero comic book stuff. That's why I write a blog every week on comic books, mostly focusing on the nostalgic aspect of it. Yeah.
So what is it that's still important about these stories that we need to keep reading these stories?
I think they give us hope.
Great.
Steve might tell us about, because but that kind of hope, just that there's still good in the world.
Hey, right. Can I, for 1 second, Ed? I hope you understand. and this is not backpedaling, but I hope you understand that what I'm saying is that I long for the ability to see things the way that you saw them. I want to have grown up in the environment that you grew up in, and to see things the way that you saw things. And my prayer, my constant prayer, is that this nation will once again return to that place. And so it's not a hatred for our nation by any stretch of the imagination. It's a hatred for where we're at. Right now.
Yeah, I completely concur with that. We're at a completely lunatic time,
Yeah.
you know, where nobody can get along, and you get accused of all sorts of vile things just for your opinion on something.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Chris, what about you? Why are these stories still so important to us?
Well, I agree with what everyone else is saying about escape. I think people need that. I know I do. I don't want to watch reality shows. I don't want to watch people's other miserable lives. I want to see fantastic. I want to see science fiction, superheroes, and then I've read a lot about how superheroes are modern day, mythological characters. I think Stan Lee talks about it a lot. That humans have always had characters like that they tell stories about and listen to stories about. And I think that superheroes are. I agree with them that superheroes are the modern day version of that.
Great. And what's the important thing that you hope these stories keep telling new readers?
I like what Ed said about hope. I mean, we've gone through bad times before. I know I was very young, but I remember Watergate, and I remember everyone thought it was like the worst thing that could possibly happen. And, we got over it. Things were okay years later. I think we do need hope, and I think we need stories that show the triumph of good over evil.
Right. Well, I remember as a kid in the 70s and 80s that I could leave the house in the morning on my bicycle, and I was not expected to be back home before dark. And we didn't have cell phones, and no one had any clue where I was. We had thousands of acres of woods behind our house. I grew up in a very secluded rural area, and nobody had any pretense to what we were doing all day. And so anyway, I too kind of long for those simple times. And one thing that I've noticed happen in our country and in our world in the last probably decade or so is we all are hyper aware of awful things going on in the world, and we know about these things going on in the world because someone has pulled out their cell phone and broadcast these awful things as they're going on, live on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and whatever, and we're all watching it. But we're all busy filming it instead of stepping in and doing something about it. And that's one thing that I really love about these superhero stories as well. Everyone else is standing around filming it so they can have their 15 minutes of fame, of internet stardom. This other person is running into the situation to do something about it. And I hope that spurs us to show the better angels of our nature. And that's what I love about these stories, and what I hope the creators keep telling is that there is a way, like Ed said, they still bring hope, and like Chris said, that these are these are our modern mythological characters, our modern American mythology, and so anyway, that's my 2 cents. Steve, you've got another set of these books coming out, don't you? Haven't you just started a new group?
Yeah,
so
we have.
What's the plan for the next set?
Well, we have book 3, which in reality I don't know how I number them. I guess heroes get the odds and villains get the evens. I don't know why. But book 3 is going to be Collateral Damage, which will be a collection of hero stories, and book 4 is aptly named Ha Ha Ha. And very super villain. There you go. Very ha ha ha. And so right now, of course, if there are any authors that are listening that would like to get on board, I am still recruiting. I think every guy on this broadcast right now, there's only guys on this broadcast. What is going on? Where are all the ladies? There are plenty of ladies on there as well. And so if any of the guys or ladies are watching this that would like to get involved, it is a super fun little family that we've created amongst the authors. I would hope that everybody would agree. It's probably the easiest, most fun group of people I've ever done work with. And so I would invite you, just send me a message and say, I want to get involved in Ha 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 or Collateral Damage, and we'll make it happen.
Awesome. Steve Bowyer, Ian Garner, Ed Ghazni, and Christopher Vallon, thank you guys so much for taking time out of your Saturday afternoon to come on and talk about superheroes.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.